Welcome to this event. Today we have Brendan O'Neill returning to our web meetup. He was here around almost 1.5 months ago. It was the beginning of the lockdown, and it's one of my favorite events ever because we were one of the first events, and Brendan was one of the first intellectuals who actually challenged or even asked some difficult questions about the lockdown. So it's great to have him back today. So Brendan is an author and he's a columnist and he's the editor of Spiked, which is an online magazine who I encourage everyone to check. We also have Razi Ginzberg. Razi is the director and the founder of Ayn Rand Centre UK. And the topic we will discuss today is what is next for climate alarmism. So while we're in lockdown, you could expect that one of the main concerns would be when we go back out there in a world that will be different and in need of vast economic recovery, what is the role that environmentalism is going to play? Because today, for example, we saw a report in BBC by an independent body advising the government that says that governments should prioritize sectors that will put down their CO2 emissions. And on the other side, we have a lot of people that saying, look, the lockdown is not that bad after all, because see what is happening. The air is clearer, we can see through the sea in Venice, and the animals are even returning to the outskirts of the cities. So maybe things are not that bad after all. And I think this is a narrative that needs to be questioned. And without further delay, because today's event is going to be slightly shorter, we're going to finish around 10-15 minutes past 8. We will start with Razi.
A few years ago, I was at a wedding and I was talking to this climate researcher who was telling me about his work researching climate change and its effects in Africa. And he was telling me how there are communities of subsistence farmers who even the slightest changes in world temperatures affect them and can affect them to such an extent that they can no longer sustain themselves the way they did. Now, to me, I'm going to take at face value, just for the sake of the argument, that everything he said. Now, to me, the problem is clear and the solution is clear as well. The solution to that is for them not to be subsistence farmers, to maybe try what the West has done and use fossil fuels, basically fossil fuel technologies, to advance and progress and be able to take on any changes in the climate. Environmentalists, the solution is also obvious, but it's somewhat different. To environmentalists, the fact that somebody wants to live as minimal a life as possible is a strong argument against anyone else living more than that, living the type of life of abundance that we experience and we live in the West. So yeah, basically they demand that all achievements and all progress be abolished because some people might not be able to live at a very basic level. And I think this is the nicer version of environmentalism. This is the version that pretends to care about humans and uses human life in their argument. There's a much worse version, which is I think the David Attenborough type humans are a plague on the planet argument, which basically would like to see nature in its pristine form. It would like to see everything act within its nature except humans, because humans are acting within our nature when we use our mind to improve the environment for us. And I want to bring up one of my my good friend and one of my favorite philosophers, Dr. Andrew Bernstein, has this line that he uses sometimes in his talks when this rhetorical question where he asks, how is a bird's nest or a beaver dam more more natural than a skyscraper. You know, animals act based on their instinct to preserve their own life, and humans act using their mind uh, to discover reality and to live the best life that we can. And so human progress is natural. It is humans acting within their nature. But I want to actually focus on the arguments that do kind of pay lip service to the humans, and the poster child of environmentalism. Although she's a teenager, so we can give them credit that she's not an actual child anymore. But she was warning a few months ago that people are dying, and of course, that argument in that context is completely untrue, and it's the opposite of what is the truth, which is that humans are living longer, better lives because of our use of fossil fuel technology, and abolishing fossil fuels, which is the ultimate goal of the environmentalists, means taking human life back hundreds of years. And but this was a popular message, and she's a very popular spokesperson. I think there's a problem though with using that kind of language today as opposed to a few months ago, because today we are in a type of crisis where humans are actually dying, and so we are experiencing what climate alarmists are claiming is either happening or is imminent. And of course, they have been saying that this is imminent. Environmentalists have been saying this for over 50 years. So uh, this message might not work anymore, at least for the foreseeable future. And the question is, well, the question in the title is what's next for them. And I know some people who are optimistic about the environmentalist cause basically losing out, losing ground over this. I am not that optimistic. I think they will have to adjust, and they will adjust in such a way that they might be stronger coming out of this than they were going in. Uh, the reason we're not hearing a lot from them now is because like every type of sleeper cell, they know when not to act, and they also know when they should act. So they're waiting, and when it's time, we will hear from them. And when the time does come, I think there's a very strong likelihood that they're going to point to the current situation and say, look, we haven't had flights. We're basically barely leaving home, and somehow we're surviving. Of course, this only pertains to those who aren't dead because of COVID, but they're not going to be featured in the arguments by environmentalists. And we can absolutely expect them to double down before things get back to normal, so to speak, and try as much as they can to gain as much ground as possible and keep as much of these restrictions as is politically viable to them. So I want to end my opening remarks with a sort of a call to action to anybody who values human life. I think this was the case before, but it will be the case even more so now, and once we move beyond the COVID-19 pandemic, which is we need to stand up to the people who are against human life as such. And I think this can go very badly, very quickly, but it can also not. If the right type of arguments are put forward in favor of the humans over pristine nature, I think there is an opportunity for our side, the pro-human side as well.
Thanks. Let's go to Brenda.
So I just want to say a couple of things, really. The first is I think there are two responses from Greens to the current crisis. And those two responses are really envy and opportunism. They're envious because COVID-19 has achieved in a very short period of time what they have been spending decades trying to achieve, which is no planes in the sky, factories closed, people not able to work, and basically life brought to a standstill. This is their dystopia come to life, and it was achieved in a very short period of time by this novel virus that kind of came out of the blue. So you can see that, as Razi was saying, in the way they talk about the COVID world as if it's this wonderful thing, you know, how wonderful our skies are, the air is clean, things are quiet, you know, this is exactly how they want life to be. And then the second response is opportunism. I think they really unquestionably see an opportunity in the economic shutdown and in the culture of fear, more importantly, to push further their misanthropic, illiberal, fearful agenda and their anti-human agenda. So they definitely see this as something they can build on and something they can use to force through even more stringent anti-human, anti-growth measures. So we have to be incredibly wary. We have to be on our feet, and we have to challenge them all the time, I think, because I think they are a menace to human freedom and they are the enemies of human progress. And we shouldn't be shy about saying that. But I think one other point I wanted to try and draw out is I think it's important to understand what environmentalism is, because sometimes we see it as this movement that is external to mainstream society. We all have this tendency to view it in that way, and Razi talked about how they will, you know, maybe ramp up their pressure and become more politically active, and I think that's true. But I think it's important that we appreciate that environmentalism is not simply a movement or a group of people. It is the heart and soul of contemporary capitalism. And it is in many ways, it fundamentally expresses capitalism's loss of faith in itself. And I thought what was really striking in recent days was the number of incredibly wealthy people who have come out to say, let's go for a greener world after COVID-19. So there was this letter signed by people like Madonna and Kate Blanchett saying, you know, we have to have less unbridled consumerism after this disaster. We have to have a cleaner planet. You know, they all signed this letter in their vast mansions in Hollywood. It's so disgusting. It makes you want to vomit. But also there was a survey of leading economists and bankers who said that we need to have a greener world after COVID, and the economic recovery needs to take on board the climate change challenge. The former head of BP has said we have to start moving to a post-oil world. There's great excitement about the potential collapse of oil and the collapse of fossil fuels, which is a complete fantasy. That's not going to happen. It's not possible. So those are things that have just happened over the past few days, and they are a snapshot of something that I think is incredibly important, which is that environmentalism is actually one of the main ideologies of the ruling class right now, in the sense that it expresses their sense of political exhaustion, moral exhaustion, and economic exhaustion. And it's through the ideology of environmentalism that the capitalist elite most clearly expresses its abandonment of its own project and its abandonment of the idea of you know, remaking the earth in mankind's image, and all those other stirring ideas of the revolutionary bourgeoisie 200, 300 years ago. So the reason it's important to see environmentalism in that way is because the only way we can challenge it is if we understand how deep-rooted it has become, if we understand how powerfully it impacts on all elements of elite political thinking and elite economic thinking. And if we realize that, you know, the reason someone like Greta Thunberg, you know, the prophetess of doom, the reason that she is so flattered and loved by the European Union, by the American establishment, apart from that brave rebel Donald Trump, and others around the world, is because she embodies their own contempt for contemporary society and modernity. So it's very easy to have a pop at someone like Greta Thunberg or Greenpeace or George Monbiot, and I love having a pop at these people. It's one of my favorite things. but they are only extreme expressions of an ideology that is well and truly inside the gates, and it is absolutely powerful in the educational establishment, in the political establishment, and in the economic, amongst the economic elite. So this is something I think is really important to bear in mind, because I completely agree with what Razi said, that this ideology has to be challenged. It is a deathly ideology. It is anti-modern, anti-progress. It will contribute to excess deaths through its vicious campaigning against economic growth, particularly in the third world, where people have already been condemned to death, in my view, by our overreaction to COVID-19, which is now 120 million people in India have lost their jobs. This is a catastrophe of almost unprecedented proportions, and things will get worse if the anti-human green ideology is allowed to become even more powerful after COVID-19. So we have to challenge it, that's unquestionable, but we have to understand where it lives, why it is so influential, and why it is cleaved to so passionately by significant sections of the capitalist establishment and the supposedly free market elites. And if we do that, I think we'll have a better chance of unraveling it and really consigning it to the dustbin of history.
Thanks a lot, Brennan. So people who want, they can raise their hands to ask questions. I'll start with a couple of questions. So the other day, we saw a lot of controversy with Gov's bookshelf. And one of the books that created this controversy was Atlas Shrugged. And the one comment that no one did was that if Gove was in Atlas Shrugged, he would be the bad guy. He would be the guy trying to stall the economy, because this was the guy that some months ago, correct me if I'm wrong, said that from 2035 we cannot buy cars that are non-electric. So, and the question is, what's in it for that elite to go down that path? So it's easy to propagate slogans, it's easy to virtue signal, but now people, as you said, people will be dying. And no matter where the COVID death rate goes, it's never gonna reach the amount of people who die every year in the third world because of energy poverty. So now we'll have to face these things for real. So it's not anymore cocktail parties discussion. So why would that elite stick to that agenda and stick to that narrative when even their self-survival as our leaders is based on us getting out of this crisis? So wouldn't they have to face reality after all?
Well, it's a very contradictory process. So it's not as if this is a smooth thing for elites. It's not as if environmentalism is a very simple idea for them. It's a very contradictory idea, because on the one hand, it provides them with a sense of virtue. It provides them with a new sense of connection, particularly with younger generations, and it allows them to present themselves as the caretakers of the planet and all that kind of stuff. But on the other hand, it's a very destructive phenomenon, and it does great against the things that the capitalist class in particular were most interested in, which is new avenues for growth and free trade and all those other things. So it's a contradictory process, and sometimes environmentalism just becomes untenable as an ideology, and that's why they will void certain treaties or ignore certain treaties, because it just gets in the way of what they need to do. But as an ideology, I think what it does, it provides them with a moral justification for their inability to grow in a sufficient or even way. And what I think environmentalism did, particularly from the 1970s onwards, it became the cover under which the capitalist class could hide their own failings. And then it took on a life of its own and became really the kind of moral anchor of modern times. And it's something that you all have to sign up to, or else you're a bad person. So I think it is, from the huge crises of the 1970s onwards, which have never been properly resolved. They've either been pushed aside or disguised or hidden beneath the influx of credit or whatever else it might be. They've never been resolved, and environmentalism allows modern society to say, well, maybe growth is not a good idea anyway. Maybe society should be organized around other ideals rather than growth and progress, such as well-being, clean air, environmental friendliness, and all that other nonsense. So I think that's the role it has played, but it has taken on a life of its own, and it's become its own kind of monster, which at some point, I think, it could crash up against the needs of modern society in a way that's quite interesting. Whether that will happen after the COVID pandemic, I'm not sure, but it is possible, because the desperation in the third world in particular is going to be so grave after this crisis that the necessity of growth and the necessity of progress could become a bit clearer. So I think those questions are up for grabs, but we do have to wrestle with the fact that at the moment, there is this uniform notion that the green road is the right one to go down after COVID-19, and that has to be really challenged.
Thank you. We'll go to Razi, and then we'll go to the audience. I already see Richard, and Steven says in the chat he has a question. So Razi.
Thanks. Yeah. So you asked if the environmentalists are going to have to face reality post-COVID. I mean,
not only the environmentalists, also the political elites that basically share the same narrative.
Right, but the whole narrative is based on denying reality. I mean, look at environmentalist activists who block the road for other people, and I guarantee you, most of them at least got there with some type of fossil fuel powered device. And if not, if they somehow got there on their bikes, those bikes were created using fossil fuels, and everything they're wearing was created with fossil fuels. And I remember during the Extinction Rebellion last year, that there was this woman who was on Piers Morgan's show, and he challenged her. He said, "Do you have a TV? Do your kids have iPads?" And she refused to answer because, of course, they do. And of course, this woman doesn't practice anything of what she preaches, but they're preaching this, and they're forcing this upon us. They're not saying, let's all make the choice as individuals to not use anything that comes from fossil fuels ever again. And then, you can go to the forest and, as I've said in the past, and try to live without any type of technology and see how that goes. But they don't. They advocate for things. They're much like much like Neil Ferguson. They advocate for things they don't believe are doable. So they just try to have government impose it on everybody else, and they don't practice it themselves. And Vladi posted in the chat about the documentary Planet of the Humans, which I've watched twice in the past week, and I recommend watching it, although I definitely don't agree with the underlying message. So in that movie, those of us who don't get our climate-related news from the IPCC or their press officer, there wasn't much new in there. We weren't shocked to hear that that wind and solar don't work, and a lot of energy is a lot of fossil fuel based energy is spent in the charade that is wind and solar. But the underlying message of that movie was that even these attempts are evil, because humans are still raping the planet, or however you want to put it. So with the hardcore environmentalists, I think that they tend to be more honest about what they want, and they want human life as we know it completely abolished. But again, even they don't actually practice that. They only preach it. So that's their connection to reality. They advocate for something they themselves don't believe is doable because they choose not to do it.
Right. So let's go to the audience. I'll start with Richard.
Very interesting introductions. Thank you, Brendan and Razi. I think Razi makes an interesting point, and just to sort of slightly respond to Nikos's question, which I think is always an interesting question. If you have a society which ultimately has scarcity as its problem, those at the top will always try to suggest that this is about as good as it gets and we shouldn't really be expecting very much more. There is, of course, a massive hypocrisy within that, as Razi was just kind of pointing out. It doesn't take very much effort to say, well, hang on, are you really serious about wanting to completely roll things back so that there are no cars and no mobile phones and so on and so forth? But that's what makes it interesting. The fact that there is such an easy, apparently straw man that you could set light to, and yet we all buy into it. I think we have to remember that it isn't just the kind of top of society that's saying this. We're all basically saying it in our own ways. There's very few people who are going out there and arguing anymore for technological progress, for almost any kind of progress. I remember when I was standing for the Brexit Party and had the only hustings that I was involved with, because the only ones that were organised were by, of all people, Extinction Rebellion. And I was literally the only person who, on that, amongst all the other politicians, candidates, who said, I think there should be more airports. I mean, I was the only person on there who said that. And that's a reflection of how far we have lost any belief in any kind of technological progress. And you just have to look. I mean, the COVID thing really, I think, is emblematic of this, insofar as we've all responded to say we have to do less. We can't take this on. This is bigger than us. We are powerless against this. That is a narrative which we've heard for many, many years. It is the environmental narrative, and it has become the mainstream narrative. So all of these ideological positions, they're very, very deeply seated. They're very, very deeply seated in a fear of progress and technology. And so the job we've got to take on, I mean, is that basically, and it's a massive amount of work that we have to do, but it is a loss of faith that runs very, very deep and amongst, I would say, 95% of us at the moment.
Right. And actually, it's very interesting what you said, because also the people who tend to advocate for stay at home are the people who it's very easy for them to stay at home. So there's maybe some hypocrisy there. Anyway, Brendan, any comments on Richard's points?
I think in relation to the COVID stuff, I think I've noticed something similar in terms of it's being treated as so large and so unprecedented and so huge. Humanity can't possibly deal with it. There's an extraordinary level of defeatism and an extraordinary level of fear. I can't believe how we've responded to COVID-19. I think in my view, it's psychotic. And it seems to me unquestionable now that the cure is worse than the disease in terms of the closure of society and the shutdown of the economy, which I think demonstrates something quite important, which is the destructiveness of the precautionary principle and the destructiveness of the ideas that actually underpin environmentalism too, which is that we have to hide away from these problems. We are nothing in the face of nature. Nature is this kind of awesome, all-powerful force that can just lay us to waste with a flick of a finger. All those ideas, I think, are influencing how we view COVID-19. So instead of treating it as a practical, challenging crisis and one that deserves a lot of resources and research, we treat it as this, visitor from Mother Earth come to punish us, and we all have to kind of bow down and weep in front of it. So I think what that really demonstrates is when you diminish mankind to such an extent, which the green ideology has done over the past few decades, you really create a situation where we no longer even think we're very capable of tackling a virus. So I think the whole culture around COVID-19 and the absolutely destructive response of Western elites to COVID-19 shows how we've really been stripped bare by the environmentalist ideology and left unprepared for exercising human ingenuity in the face of natural problems.
Razi.
So yeah, this is actually somebody points out in the chat that Extinction Rebellion are trying to shift the Overton window, the range of policies acceptable to the mainstream. I don't think they're really shifting it that much. I think Extinction Rebellion are well within the Overton window. We are way outside, because we are telling people basically that they're right in action. They're right in what they choose to do, but they're wrong in what they say, which is the opposite of what they choose to do. So I think Extinction Rebellion are actually, they're much better positioned than we are, because they're winning at this point.
Hi, so this is a question for, I think, mainly Brendan. So I'm one of those sort of incurable optimists who think that the environmentalists are going to self-destruct because there's no possible way that they can succeed. So one statistic that I have in mind is over 90% of the world's energy, taking into account everything, not just electricity generation, but all kinds of energy needed for transport, etc., comes from fossil fuels. So this is a number that is easy to look up and sort of unknown to most people. This is not going down significantly. There's no sign this is going down significantly. All the news that you hear is of certain countries which managed to, Germany may for one day manage to generate all its electrical power, in theory, from solar and wind. It turns out when you look at the details, it would have been better for them not to even attempt to generate that power, because the fact that they had to run a coal plant in backup, or the fact that they had to sell off the excess surge of wind power they get that they cannot use on their grid, sort of defeats the whole purpose. And plus, if you look at how renewables are accounted for in the UK, you might, get a government report telling you that this amazing miracle that renewables are providing so much energy for us. And when you look at the details, the actual majority of that is biomass, which is burning wood, burning garbage, etc. Which, if you look at their literature, they'll, throw in your face that, they'll have a picture of a, windmill and a picture of the sun and solar panels, giving you the impression that all that energy, all that renewable energy is coming from those things, when it's not. So I think we're kind of saved by just the practicality of environmentalists, and they're unable. I don't think they're actually able to achieve what they want to achieve. What they can do in the meantime is cause a lot of suffering by taxing, reliable sources of energy, funding and giving lots of subsidies to these to solar and wind, and wasting a lot of people's money. And in Germany, they doubled the price of electricity for people, so that caused a lot of energy poverty. So there's going to be a lot of suffering, but I cannot see them winning, because I think they have an impossible task.
I think someone mentioned Michael Moore's documentary. There was a good review of it on Spiked, and I'm putting it in the comments. So, Brendan.
Yeah, so as I was saying earlier, there are huge contradictions in the environmentalist ideology. It grates against itself. It's conflictual. It's not a straightforward process, and sometimes it is very powerful, and other times it kind of falls to the wayside when nations realize that there are certain things they have to do. I've been to China a few times, and the environmentalist ideology is not very well ingrained in the Chinese elites, because there are certain things they need to do. They need to produce, they need to build factories, they need to build airports, they need to build roads. So they are incredibly hostile, particularly to Western NGOs, green NGOs, who they look upon with quite rightful suspicion, in my view. So it's a conflictual process, and even in the West itself, there are times when environmentalism just doesn't work, because there is certain things that we need to achieve. But I don't think that takes away from how influential it is, and how what a profound role it plays in the organization of politics today, and particularly in the sphere of education, and in the sphere of moral education. So it plays an incredibly important role, even though it gives rise to tensions and conflicts with the necessity of growth and the necessity of progress. I think it's really worth, if you look back in history, dodgy green ideas have been around for a very long time. You can really trace them back to Malthus and his overpopulation thesis, which was fundamentally a response to the French Revolution and the radicalism of the French Revolution. And he was so horrified by what was happening in France that he developed this theory that if society progressed too much, we would run out of food and people would starve to death. So there has always been this reactionary, miserabilist, anti-human ideology. It just takes a different form at different times. And it is usually aimed at the idea of political progress, the idea of economic progress. You know, Karl Marx famously referred to Malthusianism as a libel on the human race, because what it did was naturalize poverty. It presented poverty as something that sprung from nature and from a lack of resources, rather than something that sprung from the organization of society and the inability of capitalist society in particular to have even growth. So, you know, throughout, over the past 200 years, there have been green ideologies of one form or another. Some have been successful, others have fallen by the wayside. But what I think is significant about the current period is that the green ideology has been influential for a very long period of time. We're really talking 30 or 40 years now. It has been this almost unchallenged ideology, and that's the thing that concerns me. The longevity at the moment is the thing that concerns me, which suggests it is quite deep-rooted at the moment, and it will take a lot of work to unearth it and cast it out.
Razi.
Unfortunately, I agree with that. I hope I'm wrong and that Ayn is right, but I think, yeah, as Brendan has said, you know, this movement has stuck around for a while, and I think it's not just we should look at it not just as part of this sort of green or anti-human movement, or let's say anti-human and pro non-human nature, but it's a totalitarian movement. It wants totalitarianism, and there have been totalitarian movements in the past that have been successful. So will the environmentalists wipe out the humans? I don't think so, but I do think things can get very, very, very bad before they get good, unless we properly challenge them, and as Richard mentioned, there's not enough of that challenge. And what I forgot to say before was this quote by Ayn Rand that I wanted to read, and I think it's from the anti-industrial revolution. And she says, "The uncontested absurdities of today are the accepted slogans of tomorrow. They come to be accepted by degrees, by dint of constant pressure on one side and constant retreat on the other, until one day when they are suddenly declared to be the country's official ideology." I think we are at the end of that process, and you know, it's now or never for those of us who want to challenge it.
There's definitely a point that it has deep roots. I mean, I'm an objectivist who writes for Spiked, and yet the most controversial thing I've ever said that shocked my colleagues is that David Attenborough is not a force for good. So it's like the one thing that's like, oh, now you've gone too far. Okay, Stephen.
Yeah, hello everyone. Staying on the philosophical points and the ideas surrounding the roots of environmentalism, I think you're right, Brendan, in pointing towards the French Revolution for this, because I think that there is definitely a Rousseauian premise around the idea of the climate. Because I think what we're looking at here is this idea that, like people have said, that the human elements, the technological elements of the world are unnatural because they somehow do not arise out of this Rousseauian concept of a state of nature, and that everything that is not human, that is sort of quote unquote natural, is beautiful and perfect and somehow in this harmonious equilibrium, which, you know, any good sort of geologist or similar scientist can tell you is just not true. Like the Earth has been in a state of chaos since its beginning. And I think this really needs to be challenged and tackled, is our understanding of the climate as being something which is separate from society, technology, and human beings.
Thanks, Stephen. Brendan.
Yeah, the point I was trying to make is I think Malthusianism comes out of a reaction against the French Revolution rather than out of the French Revolution itself. And I think contemporary environmentalism really has its roots, in my view, in the reaction against the bourgeois revolutions of the late 1700s and the early 1800s, which I think were incredibly positive events, and particularly against the Industrial Revolution. So the whole, the whole movement of Romanticism, for example, the idea that these green and pleasant fields were being destroyed by satanic mills, all that stuff has been around in English thinking and other nations thinking too for quite a long time. So it really springs fundamentally from a reaction against modernity. And then it takes a different form in different eras of modernity. So in one era, it can be obsessed with pesticides, as it was in the 1950s. In another era, it can be obsessed with overpopulation, as it was in the 1800s and the 1900s. And then today, it can be obsessed with the completely invented idea of climate change, which is really an ideological category rather than a scientific one, which is used to demonstrate the idea that mankind has a destructive impact on its surroundings. So it kind of changes shape over time, but it expresses a similar idea, which is the notion that industry and progress and all those other things are in some way polluting and problematic and unnatural, and that humankind should stop doing it. One thing I'm really keen to challenge, and I'd be interested to hear people's thoughts on this, I always want to challenge the idea that environmentalism is a left-wing phenomenon. I know that much of the left pushes environmentalism these days, so does much of the right. But I think that's something worth challenging too, because in fact, if you look back to the history of the left in its early days in the 1800s, the left emerges, in fact, as a reaction against the idea of limits, and against the idea of natural limits. And if you read Karl Marx's writings on Malthus, it's really in those writings that you start to see the emergence of a very interesting tension between reactionary, romantic environmental ideas and the more radical left-wing ideas, which were about transforming society rather than protecting nature. I think sometimes there's a confusion in the discussion that environmentalism is a left-wing manifestation, when I think a broader historical understanding would suggest that environmentalism comes about following the collapse of the left rather than being an expression of the left.
Yeah, and one of the senior Bolshevik intellectuals, Maxim Gorky, when he was still inspired by a big vision for humanity and before he became a Stalinist apologist, he had this brilliant quote, which he said, when Soviet humankind defeats its class enemy, it will have to defeat its final enemy, which is nature. And basically he meant that nature are limits that need to be overcome. And imagine saying this today to a leftist, they would freak out and they would say, oh, this is probably a quote by Breitbart or by, I don't know, these crazy guys at Spikes. And yeah, what a U-turn. Razi.
Yeah, I can't comment about the French Revolution because I don't know enough. But on the left versus right point, I think broadly speaking, those terms don't really mean anything, because people are sort of, at this point at least, because people sort of attach themselves to one side and then they stick to that side, even as the ideology associated with that side keeps changing. I mean, I remember a few years ago in America, I remember in 2004, when the left, the Democrats, were saying that George W. Bush is a warmonger, and then 12 years later, people were concerned that if the Democrats win, there's going to be World War III, and the Republicans had previously thought of Russia as, at the very least, a foe, if not an enemy, and then shortly afterwards, in the conservative political CPAC, I don't know what it stands for, their annual conference, they were waving Russian flags. I do think what we call the left today generally tends to be stronger on this point. But much like in the quote from Rand that I read, I think the right has no, they have even less of a clear ideology than the left. And so they sort of it chips away at them, and it took them longer, but David Cameron took over and then changed the Conservative Party logo from the Liberty Bell to a tree, and he was very proud of his environmentalist credentials, and I think it was him who rode the bike to the office and had a car bring his briefcase. So yeah, in this context especially, I would agree on to some extent that it's not just of the left. I think that's kind of where it came from, but I also think it's very difficult to use these terms at all. So I stick to terms like socialist, conservative, capitalist, to whatever extent the ideologies mean something. You can celebrate or accuse people for what their ideology is, rather than which side they're associated with.
Yeah, although even ideology won't get you that far. Anyway, we have some more minutes, so 2 more hands I see. So let's go with Tom.
Okay, thank you very much, Nikos. Brendan, great to finally, I've never met you before, but I'm doing it by the power of modern technology. So there you go. I wanted just to make a short observation and then ask a question. The short observation is that last year, as you know, was the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 moon landing. One of the things that struck me about it, in terms of how it was covered last year, in contrast to how Ayn Rand wrote about it in one of her greatest essays ever, was every time anyone mentioned about the grandeur of what Mr. Armstrong and Aldrin and Collins and all the rest of them pulled off, there was always this big qualifier about, yes, but look at how more important it was that we could see the Earth, and we all got worried about the environment when we looked at it through the cabin of the spacecraft. There was always this big undertone of but, and about all of this waste that they put up as they launched this Saturn moon rocket. There was no sort of what I would call tub thumping, joy about the fact that we had put men on the moon and brought them back in one piece 50 years ago. And I think that itself was a cultural identifier. It showed you how much of a problem we have, because in the 60s, although Rachel Carson and others were beginning to create a storm of concern about environmental issues, is that there was still a tremendous amount of optimism in the air to do with things like space flight and technology. And being a bit of a geek myself, I wish I was young at that time. That sort of emotion has seemed to have gone from our culture. So that's my observation. The question I've got is this, is that one big problem that I see, and this relates to the current pandemic, is that because so much of our science has become politicized, and I think that government funding of science, and Eisenhower even talked about this, has a big part to play in this. And the most obvious example of the politicization has been the climate change and all of the kind of crap that's gone on at the University of East Anglia and things like that. And I think that one of the problems with the politicization of science is that it's meant that a large number of members of the public are now so wary of anything that comes out of scientists that a lot of them are just not inclined to believe what's been said about this pandemic. And I think Matt Ridley made the point the other week that you've had the case of the boy who's cried wolf here. And I think that ironically, this pandemic is a genuine problem, but a lot of people are now increasingly skeptical about that because they just become frankly skeptical about what they've been told about climate change.
And it's interesting if after this crisis, we're going to be more trusting or less trusting on science, because there are many questions even with this one. But anyway, Brendan.
Yeah, I think the politicization of science is a central question in all of this, and the way in which science has been prostituted to the green agenda, I think, is an absolute disgrace. I think it's bad.
Yeah.
It's bad for politics and it's bad for science. It's bad for politics because it makes it less democratic if experts have a disproportionate influence. It makes it more authoritarian because it is increasingly geared towards the phony idea of saving the planet from human behavior. And it makes it more miserabilist and anti-human because the whole drive of politics in recent times has become, you know, about saving the planet from this plague called humanity. So it has an incredibly destructive impact on political life, on democratic political life. And I think the politicization of science also, of course, has a very detrimental impact on science, because science is meant to be this open-ended search for natural truth and improved understanding of the natural world. And it's supposed to be falsifiable, it's supposed to be challengeable, it's never really supposed to be settled, apart from a few scientific questions, which are pretty much beyond question now. But in the broader sense, science is meant to be an open-ended pursuit. I think when people use terms like the science says, or when they even say the science rather than just saying science, it really demonstrates how it's become almost like this biblical writ, this kind of ossified ideology that no one's allowed to question, which I think completely destroys science. You know, the slogan of the Royal Society in the 1600s was upon the word of no one, because the endeavor of science then was to question received wisdom and question prejudice and ideology, not to be the handmaiden of prejudice and ideology. And I think more recently, science has become the handmaiden of the elite's prejudice against humankind itself. So science has been completely polluted by this. And I think in relation to the COVID crisis, I think science has played a questionable role here too. I'm not sure that the problem is that people have become increasingly cynical about science. I think that's true. But I think in the COVID crisis, we're seeing also the politicization of science and the use of science to a fear-mongering end. And I think, for example, Neil Ferguson's imperial model strikes me as increasingly questionable. But it had been turned into this gospel truth that none of us was allowed to question. And I think unraveling that stuff and asking why the political class has outsourced its authority to scientific experts should be one of the key issues we take out of this crisis.
Razi, is science becoming more and more like the creeps in the State Science Institute in part 3 of Atlas Shrugged?
Yes. And on the point about that Brendan made about Neil Ferguson's conclusions being questionable, I think he agrees with you on that. That's why he doesn't practice what he preaches. And the politicization of science is, I think, it's kind of inevitable when most science is funded by governments. So the problem here is much like in many other industries, when government comes in and government has a different type of power from a private individual, a citizen, a company, which is an individual or a company can offer to do business with you. They can try to pitch their service or their product to you, and you can choose to to do business with them or not. Whereas with the government, you don't have that choice. And scientists also know they don't have that choice in many cases. In the field of climate, there are scientists who know that they will lose their jobs if they don't push the agenda. Basically, they don't say something that fits the agenda of we need to use less fossil fuels, and we need to replace that with wind and solar. And there's another problem, which is when the other side of the same coin, basically, which is when scientists become policymakers, because that's not their job. They can say, okay, there's this pandemic, and this is what might happen. When they're at the point like Neil Ferguson, of basically telling politicians what to do, then we see the kind of stuff that we've seen over the past couple of months, which is, we get the kind of stuff that we get the kind of policies that maybe people might support, but nobody voted for, and politicians would be very unlikely to implement, I think, without being able to point to these so-called experts. And one small point, somebody says in the chat that Malthus is right. Population growth will exceed the food supply if we lose our sources of energy. And yeah, that's also a thing that's kind of something the government does, which is they create a problem and then they offer a solution, which is more government intervention in our lives.
Totally agree with Eamon, by the way. It wasn't Neil Ferguson who closed the country. It was the Tory government, just for the record. Michael?
Razi was saying at the very beginning that it was about his particular position seemed to be that environmentalism was somehow an opposition to remaking the planet in our own image of man or people. Okay, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about it, because I don't understand that concept. Okay, and coming to Brendan, I got a problem when you're trying to undermine or take away the ground of environmentalism. You've got a real problem with growth, yeah? Because take, for instance, in America right now, the fracking industry. There are no controls on the saline solution that comes out of the fracking industry, and it's radioactive. And they're actually throwing it on roads as a de-icing mechanism and so on. Now, there are a million such stories you can tell about growth and the way in which there is a degree of negligence that happens in that growth. Now, how do we actually deal with that so we don't give them ground to say, well, that's in the nature of growth itself, and the way this endless, a fight for growth goes on, you become negligent of things? Because quite clearly there's a pile of negligence which is masses high, and you can't argue against it, and they can bring it in as their weapon. So how do you deal with that?
Thanks, Michael. That makes sense. Thank you. Okay, so let's answer it in the order that, so Razi, Brendan, then I'm going to ask a 20-question last answer, and then we're done. Razi.
Yeah, so I don't think I put it quite that way, remaking the planet in the image of man. I think we should do what we celebrate every other aspect of nature doing, every animal, every type of plant, which is acting within our own nature. And acting within our own nature is using our mind to understand the world around us and to adapt it to us rather than the other way around. And I don't think there is actually much of an option there. I think to some extent we would have to do that, even if we all live the way some environmentalists would imagine we can live. We would still be doing things. We would still be, I don't know, picking fruit off of trees or something. So I just want more of that, as much as possible of that. I want to see skyscrapers, and I want to see planes flying across the world, and whatever the next inventions are. I want to see that, and I want to enjoy that myself, and I want to celebrate the fact that as humans we are capable of doing that, rather than do the environmentalist thing, what environmentalists do, which is condemn it, but still enjoy the results of it.
Thank you. Brendan.
Yes, so on the question of negligence, I mean, of course, some companies are negligent, and they should not be, and pressure should be brought to bear on them to make sure they adhere to certain standards. I've had a run-in with Yaron Brook previously on property rights. He's very much in favour of property rights. I'm a bit more sceptical, so I don't have a problem with government telling private companies that there are certain things they can do and certain things they can't do. And I think one area it's legitimate for democratic government to do that is in relation to pollution. I'm not imposed standards on pollution so that companies can't just pump loads of crap into a river, for example. That's all fine. But I do think we have to appreciate that mankind's exploitation of nature is a necessarily disruptive phenomenon. I think it's also an incredibly positive phenomenon. I think it's something we should celebrate rather than demonize. But we do have to appreciate that it is a disruptive, difficult, sometimes quite dangerous pursuit. And you know, I think I quoted Trotsky last time I was speaking to the good people of the Ayn Rand Centre, and I want to quote Trotsky again because his great line, of course, which is what I live my political life by, really, is that we have to increase the power of man over nature and decrease the power of man over man. And I really think that is something worth aspiring to. And increasing the power of man over nature is a disruptive process. It does mean we will exploit natural resources. It does mean we will cut down forests. It does mean we will reroute rivers and do all sorts of things. And if we do all that to the human good, I think it's really worth pursuing. But I do think we should come out of the COVID crisis with an aspiration to increase our power over nature and decrease our power over man. So we should definitely get rid of the environmentalist ideology, pursue progress, while at the same time completely and utterly dismantling the lockdown ideology and the social distancing ideology, and returning as soon as possible to an era of freedom.
Thank you. So we are in our last minute. So Brendan, you were with us almost 40 days ago. So in 20 seconds, are you more optimist now or more pessimist, or how do you see the prospects for human flourishing or freedom compared to 40 days ago?
I'm a bit more pessimistic at the moment. It changes on a daily basis, but at the moment I'm quite pessimistic because of all the surveys showing that people are reluctant to go back to work and reluctant to go back to their social lives. Now, obviously, surveys have to be taken with a pinch of salt. The public has currently been decommissioned. There is no such thing as the public at the moment because we're all just sat at home. So public opinion is a bit of a myth. But I think that fearfulness suggests that Project Fear around COVID-19 is being quite successful. And I think public health officials and other forms of authoritarian will try to build on this by creating what they are referring to as the new normal. And it will be a new normal of distant relationships, no touching, no hugging, strict rules about who you can speak to and where you can go and how many people you can associate with. I think we should be incredibly wary of the sinister phrase, the new normal. And it's an ideology we may have to tackle head on. But at the moment, I'm pessimistic. And I think the promoters of the new normal are proving quite successful right now.
On the plus side, many objectivists like the Trotsky comment. So there's that. Right. So Razi, give us the parting words and finish it off.
Yeah, so in the short run, I would say I'm also pessimistic, and I think we will, as Brendan said, we will see the new normal being elements of what we've experienced in the past couple of months sticking around for a very long time. There's also, I think, as a result of what has already been done and of more of this, the economy is probably going to take a very, very long time to bounce back. In the long run, I am optimistic because we're here and we're having these discussions, and we're not gonna let the environmentalists win. So it might take some time, but in the long run, I think if we keep up the good fight, we should be optimistic.
Good. So thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Razi. Many thanks to everyone in the audience. So see you soon. Stay happy. Stay positive. Bye bye.